Dust settled on the agency envelope before Sarah ever opened it. She had set it on the table 3 times that week and walked away, because reading the names made the whole arrangement feel as real as the rocky Montana soil outside her window, and real things could disappoint you in ways that daydreams never could. 6 names the agency had sent in 4 months. 6 careful descriptions of men willing to enter a practical arrangement. A woman alone on a homestead, acreage to work, no pretense of courtship beyond what necessity demanded. She had read each one, written 2 polite responses, received 1 reply that made her feel like livestock at auction, and quietly set all of it aside. The 7th name arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1891, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice about the water rights meeting in Billings. Her son Eli pulled the envelope from the mail sack before she could reach it. He was 8 years old and already too curious for his own good, with her late husband's dark eyes and absolutely none of her patience. He studied the envelope with the gravity of a judge examining evidence, then handed it up to her without a word. She opened it, standing at the kitchen counter. The name was Cole Whitaker, age 34, former ranch hand, current tenant farmer, references from the foreman at the Claxton operation over in Garfield County. The agency note said he had been the one to contact them, that he was seeking a homestead situation, that he was not looking for sentiment and would not pretend otherwise. Sarah read the letter twice. Eli appeared at her elbow. He had a habit of materializing precisely when he should not. "What's his name?" Eli asked. "Cole," she said. Eli turned the name over in his mouth the way he did with hard candy. "Cole," he repeated. He nodded, as if he had just confirmed something important, and walked back out to the porch. Sarah watched the door swing shut behind him. 6 names before this one, and she could barely recall a single detail about any of them now. She folded the letter and went to write her reply. Cole Whitaker arrived on a Friday, which Sarah had not expected, because his letter had said Saturday. She was still in her work clothes, muddy boots, a flannel shirt with a torn pocket she hadn't gotten around to mending, when the wagon came up the road. She stood on the porch and watched him climb down. He was taller than she'd imagined, with the kind of deliberate movements that came from years of working ground that pushed back. He carried 1 bag. He left the wagon horse tied at the post and walked up to the porch without hurrying. And when he stopped at the bottom of the steps, he looked at her directly, not appraising, just looking. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "You're a day early." "I know it. I can camp in the barn tonight if that's the trouble." She considered him for a moment. The October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek bed. "It isn't trouble," she said finally. "Come inside." The kitchen was warm. She had stew on because she always had stew on in October. It was the practical thing, and she was, above all things, a practical woman. She set a bowl in front of him at the table, then sat across from him with her own hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Eli appeared in the doorway from the back room, sock-footed and wide-eyed, and stared. "Eli," Sarah said, "come sit down." Eli came and sat. He put both elbows on the table, which she normally corrected, and stared at Cole across the steam rising from the stew pot. Cole looked at the boy. He didn't smile, not exactly, but something in his face settled, like a door finding its frame. "You must be Eli," Cole said. "You're Cole," Eli said, as if this were the answer to a question he'd been sitting with for weeks. "I am," Cole said. They ate in the particular quiet of strangers who are working out whether they might eventually trust each other. After supper, Sarah cleared the table and set out the paper she'd prepared. 2 copies. She had written it herself, because the agency's standard form left out things that mattered. She slid 1 copy toward Cole and kept the other. "I want to go through the terms," she said. "I'd expect that," he said. He read without rushing. She watched his eyes move down the page and told herself she was only looking to see if he'd object to anything. not to study the lines of his face or the steadiness of his hands. "You wrote that the Northfield's mineral rights are excluded," he said. "They are. I'm keeping those separate." He nodded. "Fair." He read further. "It says here I'm to have the east room and take my meals with the household." "Yes. And you've got a line here. I want to make sure I understand it." He tapped the paper. Sarah read where his finger rested. She had written, "Neither party is obligated to perform what the other has not plainly asked for." "Yeah, that means," she said carefully, "that I won't assume you want things you haven't said you want, and you'll give me the same." Cole looked at her for a moment. "Not long, just enough." "That's a fair way to operate," he said. He reached for the pen she had set beside the inkwell and signed his name at the bottom of the page. His handwriting was plain and even, like a man who had learned to write later than most but had taken it seriously. She signed her copy. They shook hands across the table, and the agreement was made. Eli, who had been watching from the doorway for the last 10 minutes, announced to no one in particular, "Good," and went to bed. The first 2 weeks were careful. Sarah had expected awkward, and there was some of that, but mostly it was careful, like walking a fence line in the dark, each step deliberate, neither of them in a rush to stumble. Cole rose before she did, which she had not anticipated. She came down the first morning to find the stove already lit and the water bucket already filled from the creek, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with that fact settling over her. She didn't remark on it. He didn't expect her to. The work itself was what organized them. The Northfield needed the irrigation ditch cleared before freeze, and Cole took that on without being asked, spending 3 days in weather that dropped below 40 degrees before noon. Sarah worked the garden beds, the root cellar, the mending pile that had grown to a state she privately called disgraceful. In the evenings they sat at the kitchen table, she with her mending, he with whatever needed patching or sharpening from the barn, and they talked in the way of people who have a great deal to say and are in no hurry to say it. He told her about the Claxton operation, about a winter in Wyoming that had nearly finished him. She told him about how the homestead had come to her, that her husband Thomas had filed on it in '87 and worked it for 2 years before his heart gave out in the middle of a September harvest. "He died in the field," she said, and then she waited for Cole to say something sorry and well-meaning that she'd have to accept graciously. He said, "Was that the Northfield?" She blinked. "Yes." "Good ground," Cole said. "A man could do worse." She looked at him across the table. It was, she decided, possibly the kindest thing anyone had said about Thomas Calloway's death in 3 years. And it had not sounded like kindness at all, which was probably why it landed the way it did. Eli attached himself to Cole with the efficient determination of a boy who had decided something and saw no reason for delay. He followed him to the barn in the mornings, asked questions at a rate that would exhaust a schoolteacher, and reported back to Sarah with updates she had not requested. "Cole says the east fence post is rotted at the base," Eli said one afternoon. "I know," Sarah said. "He says he's going to reset it before the ground freezes." "Good. He says I can help." Sarah kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "Mind you stay out of his way." "I'm helping, not staying out of the way." It was impossible to argue with 8-year-old logic, so she didn't try. She heard them out at the fence line later that afternoon, Cole's voice low and even, Eli's piping up with a question every 30 seconds, and she let the sound of it come through the kitchen window while she worked, and she did not examine too closely the way it settled around her like something warm. November came in hard that year, the kind of hard that announced itself 3 days early in the color of the sky, a particular flat gray that old-timers in that part of Montana called the ceiling coming down. Cole saw it and said nothing. But he spent 2 full days making sure the barn was ready, the firewood stacked to the eaves of the lean-to, the root cellar organized so that what they'd need first was nearest the door. Sarah watched him work from the window more than she intended to. not for any reason she was prepared to name. The morning the first real storm hit, she came downstairs to find that he had moved her rocking chair, the one that had belonged to Thomas's mother, from the far corner of the front room to the spot nearest the stove, 6 inches to the left of where it had sat for 4 years. She stopped and looked at it. He was at the table with his coffee. "I moved the chair," he said. "I see that. It was in a cold draft from the window gap. I'll caulk the gap when the weather breaks. In the meantime, that's the warmest spot in the room." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, looking at his coffee mug. Sarah looked at the chair again. It was such a small thing. A rocking chair moved 6 inches, but Thomas had always said the cold draft built character, and she had sat in it for 4 winters and never once thought to argue. "Thank you," she said, and she said it to the chair, not to Cole, because saying it to Cole directly would have required more composure than she had at 7 in the morning. The stove became their center point. Eli did his arithmetic at the kitchen table and showed his figures to Cole, who checked them with the focused patience of a man who had once wanted schooling and knew the value of it. Sarah read in the evenings, and Cole mended harness leather, and the fire popped and the wind pressed against the window glass, and outside the snow came down in the particular relentless way of Montana winters that have decided to make a point. One evening she looked up from her book and he had built a new shelf on the wall beside the window. Simple pine boards, fitted and pegged without a single nail, exactly the right height for her seed catalogs and almanacs, which had been stacked on the floor all winter for lack of anywhere else to go. He was fitting the last peg when he noticed her watching. "Your books were on the floor," he said. "They've been on the floor for 2 years," she said. "I noticed." She put her book down. She said, "Cole, why did you contact the agency?" He was quiet for a moment, pressing the last peg flush. "I'm 34 years old," he said. "I've got good hands and a strong back, and I know how to work ground. I've spent 12 years working other men's land." He paused. "I wanted something that was mine, or near enough." "Near enough," she repeated. He looked at her then. "The terms were clear," he said. "I knew what I was signing. And you have no," she hesitated, "no objection to what the terms don't include." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "I signed the paper, Mrs. Calloway." It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. But she didn't push, and he didn't offer, and the fire crackled between them, and the shelf stood straight and true on the wall. The trouble came in January, which was when trouble always came in that country, because January had the patience to wait until people were already worn thin before it added its weight. A man named Aldrich showed up with a county surveyor and a document he said proved that the creekside boundary of Sarah's homestead had been misrecorded in '87, and that the actual line put the best 15 acres, the ones closest to the creek, the ones with the most reliable water, under a claim held by the Aldrich Family Grazing Cooperative. Sarah stood on her porch in 12 degrees of cold and read the document twice. Cole came up behind her and read it over her shoulder without asking permission, which she noticed but did not object to. "This signature here," Cole said, pointing to the surveyor's mark, "is that Hennessy?" The county surveyor, a small man with a weasel's ability to avoid direct eye contact, said it was. "Hennessy hasn't certified a county survey since 1889, Cole said. "His license lapsed. Any document bearing his mark after April of '89 would need to be validated by a licensed surveyor before it could affect a homestead claim." The county man opened his mouth, then closed it. Aldrich, who was a large man with the confidence of someone accustomed to agreements working out his way, looked at Cole with fresh attention. "And who are you?" Aldrich asked. "Cole Whitaker," Cole said. "I'm the working partner on this homestead. Not hired man, not farmhand. Working partner." Sarah heard the words and kept her face still, because now was not the moment to think too hard about what they meant. "The document will need to be reviewed," Cole continued, "evenly and without heat. by a licensed surveyor in Billings, before anyone on this porch has anything further to discuss. Mrs. Calloway will write to the county office this week. Until then, the boundary stands as recorded in 1887. Aldrich looked at the county man. The county man looked at his boots. They left without another word. Sarah waited until the wagon had cleared the cottonwoods before she turned to Cole. He was already heading back to the barn. "Cole," she said. He stopped. He didn't turn around right away, which she had learned meant he was deciding something. Then he turned. "I'll write up what needs to be in the letter to the county," he said. "I know the right phrasing." "You know land law," she said. It wasn't a question. "I picked some up," he said. There was a pause that stretched long enough to hold several things that didn't get said. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "You didn't ask," he said, "and I didn't think I'd need it." He paused. "Glad I knew it." He went back to the barn. Sarah stood on the porch in the January cold and thought about a man who came with one bag and no apparent interest in impressing anyone, and who had just stood between her and 15 acres of creekside ground with nothing but a calmly stated fact and the expectation that it would be enough. It had been enough. It always would be, she suspected, with him. The letter to the county went out the following week, and in March a licensed surveyor came from Billings and walked the boundary line in the first mud of the thaw, and confirmed what the 1887 filing had said all along. Aldrich did not come back. The cooperative sent a letter through a lawyer in town. Cole read it, said bluster, and set it on the shelf beside her almanacs. By then it was April, and the ground was opening up, and Cole was in the north field from first light most days, and Eli was trailing behind him on the days he didn't have school, and Sarah was getting up each morning into a house that felt like a house being lived in, which was different from the house she had occupied for 2 years after Thomas died, when everything in it had felt like furniture arranged around an absence. There was an afternoon in April when she brought lunch out to the field, bread and cold meat and a jar of water, and she set the basket down at the fence post, and Cole came over and they sat on the ground side by side and ate without talking much, with the spring sun doing what spring sun does, which is remind you that the winter did not win. She had been composing a sentence in her mind for several weeks, not a speech, just a sentence. She said it then, sitting on the cold ground with the mud smell of turned earth around them. "The terms," she said. "I'd like to revisit them." Cole stopped with his bread halfway to his mouth. He set it down. He looked at her sideways. "I'd like to revisit what the terms don't include," she said. She kept her eyes on the field, on the dark turned rows that Cole had put in the ground that week. "What they don't include," she said again, "is provision for a person who has been in my house since October and has not once, in all that time, given me a single reason to wish he wasn't there." Cole said nothing. He was very still, the way he went still when he was deciding something. "That is unusual," she said, "in my experience." "Your experience is thin," he said, but his voice had something in it that it hadn't had before, something careful and near. "I know," she said. 6 names before yours, and not one of them made Eli say good and go to bed. Cole was quiet for a long moment. The field smelled like promise. The creek ran at the edge of the property, clean and high with snowmelt, running over its usual rocks in its usual way, indifferent to the people sitting in the mud nearby working out something that mattered more than they had expected it to. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Sarah," she said. He turned and looked at her fully then, which he did not do easily or lightly. She had learned that about him, that he looked at things he meant to take seriously. "Sarah," he said, "if I asked you plain, if I said I would like the terms to change, I would say I've been waiting a reasonable length of time for you to say so," she said. He held her gaze, and something in his face shifted, like weather breaking. It was not a dramatic thing. Nothing about Cole Whitaker was dramatic. It was more like a door finally opening that had been unlocked for a long time, waiting for someone to simply push it. He reached over and took her hand in the mud in the April cold, just held it, and she let him, and they sat like that a while, in the field that was both of theirs now, or would be. Reverend Marsh married them on a Saturday in May, in the small church in Tennyson with a congregation of 15 people that included the storekeeper, Mrs. Hadley, who cried in a way that suggested she had found the whole arrangement scandalous in November and was now claiming credit for approving it all along. Cole wore his good coat, which Sarah had mended the collar on the week before, stitching it straight while he stood at the window and pretended not to notice. Eli stood beside Cole as if he had always planned to stand there, as if the whole sequence of events, the envelope, the letter, the man who arrived a day early, had been moving toward this particular arrangement of 3 people at the front of a small church, and he, Eli, had known it first. He probably had, Sarah thought. 8-year-old boys often did. Afterward, in the yard of the church with the May sunlight coming down generous and warm, Eli said to Cole, with the gravity of someone making a formal statement, "Now we're the same family." Cole looked down at him. He crouched to Eli's level, which was something he always did, never making the boy look up too far. "We were the same family in January," Cole said, "when that man came to the porch." Eli considered this. "When you knew the surveyor thing." "That's the one." Eli nodded. "I knew it before that," Eli said. Cole smiled. "The full kind, the rare kind, the one Sarah had only seen a handful of times and had started watching for the way you watch for a good thing you don't want to miss." "When?" Cole asked. "When you moved Mama's chair," Eli said. "That's when I knew." Cole stood up and looked at Sarah over Eli's head, and she looked back at him, and the May sun came through the churchyard oaks in long, easy bars of light, and the creek that ran at the edge of her land ran quiet and steady over its stones, and the north field was planted, and there was no draft in the front room anymore, because Cole had caulked the window gap in February. The rocking chair sat in the warmest spot in the house. A home is built by acts, not by words, and they both knew it by then. Had known it, maybe, from the first morning she came downstairs to a lit stove and a filled water bucket, and a man who had decided, without being asked, that this place deserved care. There is something this story wants you to hold close before you sleep tonight. A practical bargain drawn up in ink, signed across a kitchen table by 2 people who told themselves they were only being sensible, became something no agency could have promised and no contract could have contained. It became home. It became family. It became the kind of love that shows itself in small certain acts. A chair moved 6 inches. A shelf built quiet in the evening. A hand taken in April mud without a word of explanation needed. You never know what form the answer to a long loneliness will take. Sometimes it arrives a day early, with one bag and plain-spoken honesty, and your child meets it at the door and already knows. If this story settled something in you tonight, leave a comment below and tell us, what small act made you first feel at home with someone? We would love to hear it, and if you have not yet subscribed, please do, so you never miss another journey through the Old West. More stories of ordinary courage and quiet grace are coming your way. Good night. God bless you, and good rest.